Oftentimes, creators and game development companies are so risk-averse that they can't create a higher level of artistic and design prominence. This is one of the biggest criticisms levied at modern gaming, and it's also something heavily present in vintage game design. Capcom is one of the only companies, alongside classic Squaresoft, Midway, and others, to push the envelope on their game design, trying new things even when something else has proven lucrative. In the past, Capcom received a lot of criticism regarding the way they released multiple versions of the same game, but as someone who played the Street Fighter II line of games for the first time earlier this year, this is a bit of an oversimplification and misrepresentation. Patches didn't exist in the past, necessitating multiple version releases, and unlike today, this actually adds value to the SF2 series of games because any version, any patch, of the game is available for play. At its core, they are the same game, sure, but I've never considered that a bad thing, as re-releasing games with more content is something companies have always done, and for good reason. The reason I'm saying all of this is because Capcom could have done what modern Call of Duty or 2K does. They could have made a true follow-up to Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo that just expanded the cast and graphics, making minimal gameplay changes, but that's not what they did. I promised back in March that I'd be releasing my videos on the Street Fighter Alpha trilogy consecutively, and now it's time to do so. You're watching Rayl Deal Games, and I hope you liked today's video. I make new ones every Wednesday and Friday, and you may want to stick around for my other and future work. I may be a small creator, and as such it takes me a long time to complete everything I want to, but let it be known that I keep my promises to you all. If this series of Alpha videos does well relative to my expectations, I'll be starting my trilogy of videos on the Street Fighter 3 line of games. Street Fighter Alpha is the exact perfect way to follow up Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. It's different enough in key ways so as to feel fresh, and clearly takes the feedback Capcom probably received from Super Turbo to improve several key aspects of Street Fighter game design. That being said, I'm not making the claim that Street Fighter Alpha is better than Super Turbo, but I'm also not of the belief that sequels or spin-offs need to be better than their predecessors. They just need to be good or otherwise promising in their design, and that's what Alpha is. Considering the fact that it's the first draft of this Alpha style of game, I'd be shocked if it doesn't improve. In my Street Fighter 2 series of videos, I kept track of how much money it would have cost me to play through those games if I were doing so back in the day, in the arcades, and that type of financial and historical analysis is going to continue in this series. As such, I counted each credit as being worth 50 cents, since that's what it seems like the Alpha machines cost back in '95. I ordered my sequence of characters based primarily on my personal interest in their design and or previous knowledge of them. As such, I started with Ryu because it seemed fitting to do so, since that's how I started the World Warrior earlier this year. Because Alpha is much easier than any of the Street Fighter 2 series of games, this isn't a provision I needed to take. I've speculated many times on the channel that the arcade difficulty for many fighting games may decrease as arcade design itself began to fade in the shadow of single-player experiences and the home console market, and Alpha's difficulty definitely lends to this possibility. There's definitely outliers here that contradict this idea though, as I have gotten better at Street Fighter style games since starting my review process on the series. Also, the difficulty in the American version of Super Turbo is broken, meaning that coming from that game to this one creates a difficulty decrease whiplash. Still, Alpha cost me the least number of credits to complete with each character. My Ryu run cost me $1.50 or 3 credits to complete, and honestly, by the time I got to the final boss, I expected there to be a round of bosses that don't initially appear on the matchup screen, just like in the 2 series. However, this isn't the case. This elicits a pause, a moment of contemplation. Why are there less boss fights, and does this have to do with the lower difficulty of the game? While I can't say for certain, because I definitely do not have the skill set to analyze this game's code, it does feel like Capcom changed the way they attempt to control players' play patterns. In the SF2 series, the difficulty of several matches ramps up in round 2, possibly as a way of making the player think they are close to success, prompting them to pump more quarters into the machine. The issue with this design is that as soon as the player runs out of quarters, it's highly likely they'll be so put off by the experience that they'll never touch the game again, especially if they don't have others to play with. To Capcom's credit, I think they overall made the right business decision given the information they had at the time of SF2's development. And when I say the right business decision, I mean from Capcom's perspective. Their logic makes sense given the fact that they would have no way of knowing how popular multiplayer was going to be for World War Warrior and all of its revisions. However, as competition starts to enter the market, they need to consider not only how to get all of the quarters from someone playing their game, but also how to bring them back to do it all over again. All of this is just me spitballing here, but I would guess that lowering the difficulty and balancing out the amount of time a person can possibly spend at a machine by decreasing the number of potential matches is one of the key innovations of Alpha's design. The real money potential of Alpha is in the multiplayer, but for someone to be able to compete with another, they need two things. 1, confidence, and 2, a way and time to practice. And these things are what's provided by the difficulty decline of this game coming out of the SF2 series. These meta design decisions make sense and add to the value of Alpha to be sure, but they're also not something the average player is going to even think about. The only thing on the player's mind is this game fun or not? To this point, I'd say yes, very much so. The major innovation of Super Turbo is its super meter, and the inclusion and prominence of super meters would become one of the major defining features of Capcom fighters throughout the 90s and 2000s before every single fighter started including them. In Super Turbo, the meter mechanic matters, but not nearly to the same degree as it does in a modern fighter. Oftentimes, my matches would end before either my opponent or I even got a meter, and should one of us fill our bar, it didn't always matter in the end. In Alpha, the super mechanic is expanded upon, with the major change being that every character can bank up to 3 bars of meter that carry over between rounds. In addition to this, each character has multiple supers they can choose between, which is in stark contrast to Super Turbo, where each character has one. This change is a great improvement for getting people new to the mechanic familiar with it, since there is usually at least one fairly easy to comprehend super input per character. In Super Turbo, some characters had super moves that were substantially more difficult to input than others, making it harder to experience the mechanic with those characters. This change allows each player to pick a character they like and have a set of moves they can feasibly learn to do, even if they're new to this specific type of fighter. It's clear to me that Alpha is designed to draw in new players. This is obviously something every sequel seeks to do. However, Alpha expands upon the design without sacrificing simplicity of Super Turbo in ways beyond the raw gameplay systems. As I learned at the end of my Ryu playthrough, there's unique pre-fight banter between the player's character and the final boss of the arcade tower. This is a super cool way of establishing each fighter's characterization and relationship with other combatants. This, combined with the easier difficulty of the game, ensures the possibility of any particular player getting a story out of their experience with Alpha. A complete narrative for arcade fighters being hidden behind character endings is part of what made the first 2 Mortal Kombat games so cool. Even if I weren't planning to play through the game with each character for this video, I would have wanted to do so just to see all of these pre-fight conversations and how they lead to each character's ending. This is definitely a feature of Alpha I hope gets expanded upon in the rest of the trilogy. Guy was my second character in this game, and I truly really loved this guy's gameplay. Because of his speed and rushdown capabilities, it honestly felt like I was playing MK Light while going through the game with this character. With Ryu, I didn't need a training mode because I had already gone through the Street Fighter getting good process with him in World Warrior. However, whenever a new character is introduced in one of these games, the lack of a training mode is readily apparent. It's fortunate that I chose Guy because learning him wasn't especially challenging. This isn't really a big critique of Alpha because the game's difficulty makes up for the lack of it, but it's pretty clear at this point that training modes were going to be an expected feature of the fighting genre, as Killer Instinct on the SNES was famous for its inclusion of a practice mode. In fact, the only reason the lack of a training mode stood out to me during this playthrough is because of Bison. Bison is perhaps the only moderately challenging aspect of this game. He cost me $2 worth of metaphorical coins here, which is the largest volume of losses in one fight I had in this game. He does high damage, but the overall balancing of this game makes him feel more fair than he did in the American version of Super Turbo. My third playthrough was Birdie, and my guys, it's actually happening. Over the course of my SF2 playthroughs, I had trouble consistently pulling off the 360 command grabs of Geef. However, in my Birdie playthrough, I was able to use his 360 input reliably well, and this honestly felt super good. I love grappler characters, but 360 motions are something I've typically encountered in the fighting games that formed my love of the genre. It's nice to see some amount of muscle memory and dexterity being developed, and I bet by the time I get to Third Strike, I'll be even better. As for Birdie himself, it's cool to see him return from the original Street Fighter, but I don't like him better than Zangief. His kit is cool though, and I'm interested in seeing how he plays within the context of a roster hosting the Russian grappler himself. One credit clears are the ultimate goal of playing any arcade game. I got pretty close a handful of times to doing this in the SF2 games, but I never actually managed to pull it off. However, I did manage to do so in alpha with Adon. This is the sheerest irony too, since I enjoyed playing Adon the second least on the entire roster. What I did like about this character is the inputs for his special moves. Jaguar Tooth, which has a backwards half circle, is my favorite on his list. There's a texture, a real flavor that exists in the inputs fighting game special moves have. Pulling off one of these in a clutch situation just feels so good. So even though I overall didn't like Adon's play pattern, I do like this aspect of his design. I don't actually have much to say about my fourth playthrough, Nash, as the character is essentially just a stand-in for Guile. I didn't like him as much as Guile, but honestly, that possibly has more to do with how his buttons play within the context of alpha. It's just not as fun to me, but I could definitely see how someone would like them. His ending explaining why he isn't in SF2 is a cool bit of continuity though, and I'm definitely interested in seeing if this gets developed further in the rest of the trilogy. The character I actually enjoyed the least is Sodom though. It's strange because I typically do love grapplers, but I just wasn't a fan of this character's normals. The fact that I definitely cannot do double circle inputs, which are necessary for his super, impacts my impression of Sodom for sure. It's definitely a skill issue, but I just couldn't find any fun combos. You know, it's one thing to find a combo, but that thing also needs to be fun to do. I found a few moves that seemed to link together with Sodom, but none of them were super exciting. So by the time I finished the arcade mode with him, the experience was just forgettable. This is in stark contrast to loads of other characters, which were so fun to play that I'm excited to run through Alpha 2 with them. Sodom is definitely not on that list. Sagat feels a bit less fun to play in Alpha over SF2, at least that's what I feel after finishing his arcade tower. It's super cool that he gets recruited as a boss for SF2 in his ending though, although I was under the impression that Ryu had never lost to Sagat, so there are elements of this series' chronology that Alpha actually makes less clear for me. Chronology aside, a consistent narrative is bolstered by these character moments. It's one of those things where I just have to suspend my disbelief a hair to enjoy the implications of his ending. If I had to guess, Rose has got to either be one of the best characters in Alpha, or she's going to be in Alpha 2 because her super, Soul Illusion, just has got to be busted. The ability to double damage output with delayed hitboxes creates these situations where it actually seems impossible to lose. Out of all the characters in this game, Rose is perhaps the one I'm most excited to play again because this move just opens up the possibility for so many cool combos. One of the truths of the SF2 games is that Chun-Li is always great, so I was surprised in Alpha to see that she doesn't feel nearly as strong. There's a narrative bonus to this aspect though, as Alpha is supposed to be a prequel to SF2. It makes sense that Chun-Li would be a bit weaker in this game, and that she would massively improve by the time SF2 takes place. The fact that she loses to Bison in her arcade ending contributes to this idea too. As SF2 received more and more iterations, the complexity of the title did increase, so I am curious to see if some small amount of complexity creep makes Chun-Li more fun to play. I did encounter Dan in my Chun-Li playthrough, and as someone who's a big fan of Mortal Kombat, this is a super nice touch. I love secret matches in fighting games, and while Akuma is a cool addition in Super Turbo, I wasn't skilled enough to get to him during my time with that game. I don't know what I did to cause Dan to appear like this, but it was a fun enough diversion and a welcome surprise. I always like to close out my time with every Street Fighter game with my Ken playthrough. Coming out of the SF2 series, Ken is my favorite character in the franchise, and I love juxtaposing the two main Shotos in this way. This Alpha version is possibly my favorite of his so far, but I'd like to see how it develops over the course of the trilogy before I settle into that opinion. He cost me a whole 2 credits, a back-breaking $1, making this playthrough with Ken actually my lowest cost one in the series so far. By the time I finished Alpha with each character, the game metaphorically cost me $15.50. In today's dollars, that would be $32.43, which is not too bad for a solid gaming experience. I've definitely spent that much on whole games I enjoyed much less than this one, making Alpha the first SF game I've covered on the channel that would have been worth playing in the arcades. financially speaking. Finishing the game isn't bank-breaking, is loads of fun, and would be infinitely playable with a pair of friends. Typically speaking, I like to play games guideless. The getting good process of a new game is one of my favorite things about gaming, and guides often ruin this in my opinion. That's the approach I took with the SF2 series of games, but the downside of this is that I miss aspects of the games I play sometimes. Because I've played loads of MK in my life, I expected there to be secret characters in this game though, so after finishing each character's arcade experience, I did some research and discovered the codes to play as Alpha's boss characters. This feature is cool, but I didn't really play either Bison or Akuma for long. Bison I didn't like at all, and I didn't find Akuma to be as fun as Ken, so I stopped playing him after a few rounds. The third secret character, Dan Hibiki, I never got to experience because the code to play him is particularly difficult to input. I tried for about 10 minutes or so to get it to work, but to no avail. Alpha is the easiest SF game to learn so far, and as of right now, would be my recommendation for anyone trying to learn how to play these games. I'd even put it over Street Fighter 6 in this regard. I don't find the simplification of controls with modern schemes to be the equivalent of learning to play the game effectively. It takes out some of the hurdles, sure, but I think the hurdles in learning how to string combos and cancel into special moves in Capcom's style of fighter is better learned in this classical way. This is my impression as a longtime fighting game fan who's never played Capcom fighters for any significant amount of time before this year. On this channel, I conclude each of my reviews not with a score, but with an answer to a simple question: will this game make my top 100 list of the decade of its release? Alpha won't be making that list because, even though I quite liked a lot of the design decisions the Capcom team made with it, I do still like Super Turbo more. I suspect that one of these Alpha games will make the list though, and with just a bit more complexity, I can see the fighting framework of the Alpha series easily making it onto my top 100 of the 90s. And that's the video, my guys. What do you all think of Alpha? Let's talk about this game in the comments below, and if you liked the video today, consider smashing that like button, subscribing, and ringing the notification bell. My review for Alpha 2 will be dropping next Friday, and Alpha 3s will be coming the Friday after that. Regardless of what you choose to do, thank you for keeping it real with Rayl Deal Games. Have an awesome day, my dude.